Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax today. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from, and what time are you watching this? Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and relax. The apartment at Hollow Street. Ethan hadn't thought much about Hollow Street when he signed the lease. It was cheap, close to work, and most importantly, it wasn't her house. He couldn't stomach another night surrounded by hollow echoes of his failed marriage. The movers had long since left, their hurried footsteps replaced by a lingering quiet as he stared up at the faded brick exterior of the old apartment building. The building stood 4 stories tall, its facade cracked and pockmarked by age and neglect. Wooden shutters, once a proud shade of hunter green, now hung crooked, their paint peeling like dead skin. A tarnished plaque near the entryway read, Hollow Street Residences, EST 1902. The date seemed closer to a warning than a historical fact. Ethan exhaled sharply and tugged his bag over his shoulder, the weight of a box filled with half-empty whiskey bottles and crumpled shirts tugging his arm. "All right, home sweet home," he muttered, shoving open the heavy wooden door. It groaned on its hinges, protesting his entry like a reluctant guardian. Inside, the hallway swallowed him whole. The walls, once white, were stained a grimy yellow under the flickering light bulbs swaying overhead. He couldn't tell if it was the electricity or the weight of his footsteps that made them pulse dimly, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The hallway stretched on forever, a narrow tunnel lined with identical doors. Room numbers had faded into oblivion, leaving brass plates scarred and empty. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he walked, echoing like whispers. He turned the corner and froze. Down the hall, near his door, a figure stood. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall and gaunt, the shadow impossibly still. Ethan blinked, but the dim light made it hard to focus. His breath hitched in his chest as the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted one long arm, hand extended and pointed, right at Ethan's door. His door, 3C. "Hey, what the hell?" His voice cracked like a teenager's, lost between a whisper and a shout. The figure didn't react, didn't move, but Ethan's skin went cold. Something in his mind screamed, "Don't go closer," but his feet carried him forward anyway. The shadow's finger never wavered, like it was waiting for him. Another step. The stench of mildew and rot grew thicker in the air, so pungent he tasted it in the back of his throat. This is a bad idea, he thought. Really, really bad. He reached into his pocket for his keys, knuckles white around the cold metal. And then it was gone. Just like that. The figure disappeared between blinks. No footsteps, no sound. Just the hallway, empty and quiet. His door a mere 10 feet away. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to himself. "You're seeing things already." But as he reached his door, his hand trembling against the keyhole, he saw it. A single smudge, a shadow of a handprint on the wood, right where the figure had been pointing. Ethan woke the next day to the sharp hum of silence. No birds chirping, no distant cars passing by. The world outside seemed dead, or maybe the building had shut it out completely. He blinked at the ceiling fan turning above him, its repetitive creak like a slow heartbeat. He forced himself upright. Get it together, Ethan. The kitchen was worse than he remembered. The bulb that flickered the night before now hung dead, its glass cracked. The fridge was still humming, but when he opened it, he recoiled. Every bit of food, the bread, the eggs, the leftover takeout, was spoiled. Mold spread like dark veins across the containers, and the milk had curdled into something thick and foul. What the hell? I just bought this stuff. He shut the fridge, stomach churning. As he turned away, the TV clicked on from the living room. Static hissed from the speakers, bright white fuzz filling the screen. Ethan froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The TV wasn't even plugged in. He felt his knees go weak. Slowly, he crossed the room, crouching to check the outlet. The cord sat on the floor, coiled and untouched. "No," he whispered, stepping back. The static grew louder, filling his head, vibrating in his skull. And then, underneath the noise, he heard it. A voice. A whisper, faint and breathy, as though carried through the walls. "Ethan." He staggered, his back hitting the couch. "Who's there?" he shouted. But no one answered. The whisper grew louder, layered with more voices. They bled through the walls, seeping from the floorboards. His name repeated over and over, a chorus of unseen mouths. Ethan clapped his hands to his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. "Stop. Just stop." The sound vanished. The TV blinked off, leaving the apartment silent again. But Ethan didn't move for what felt like hours, his body trembling, sweat chilling his skin. Get out. The thought hit him like a slap. But he couldn't leave. Could he? Not yet. From the corner of his eye, the fridge door creaked open again. This time, something wet slithered across the kitchen floor and stopped just short of his bare feet. Ethan's nights became a blur of sleepless terror. The shadow returned every night, always closer. The first time, it stood at the edge of the hallway, staring into the apartment from the doorway. Ethan locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, but it didn't matter. When he turned around, the shadow was at the window, its finger, bony and dark, tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan threw the curtain shut and sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, shaking. The whispers had started again, growing louder with every passing night. They came from the walls now, constant and maddening, as if the building itself was alive. He covered his ears, but it never helped. His name was in the whispers, always his name. When Ethan finally dared to leave the apartment one night, he bolted for the hallway, only to find himself back where he started. No matter how many doors he passed, no matter how far he ran, he always ended up standing right outside 3C. "No, no, no," he mumbled, clawing at the brass doorknob. He pounded on the door to the apartment across the hall. "Hello? Is anyone here? Help me." Silence. The hallway stretched on endlessly, doors looming like sentinels. Then he heard it, a slow, deliberate creak. He turned, blood freezing in his veins. The shadow was there, closer now, inches away. It raised one arm and pointed back at his door. Ethan knew he couldn't endure another night. The air in the apartment had grown heavier, suffocating him like a lead weight on his chest. Every breath burned as though he were inhaling something toxic, and the walls themselves seemed to close an inch by inch. He could hear the wood groaning, as if the building, or something inside it, was alive, twisting closer around him. Tonight, Ethan decided he would face it. He sat on the couch, fists clenched, eyes locked on the door. The lights were out, the only illumination coming from the faint silver glow of the street lamp outside. The shadow would come. It always did. The whispers had already begun, slithering through the walls, calling his name with mocking delight. Asterisk Ethan. Ethan. Asterisk. He closed his eyes, steeling himself. "Show yourself, you bastard," he muttered through gritted teeth. "What do you want from me?" Then it appeared. The shadow melted from the corner of the room, dark and featureless, but somehow more defined than before. Its movements were slower this time, deliberate. Its arm lifted, bony and thin, the finger aiming squarely at Ethan. "I'm not afraid of you," Ethan screamed, lurching off the couch. He charged forward, fists swinging, but as he reached the shadow, it enveloped him. Cold shot through his body, freezing his limbs in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The shadow pressed in on him, like invisible hands wrapping around his throat. Ethan gasped, choking, his chest heaving for air that wouldn't come. His vision blurred, darkness spreading like ink across the edges of his sight. The whispers grew louder, layered and inescapable, drilling into his mind. "Join us." The room twisted, warped, as if the walls themselves rippled in time with the voices. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing something pulsing beneath, something alive. Ethan fell to his knees, his body convulsing under the weight of the shadow. It filled the room now, stretching to every corner, blotting out the weak light from the window. The last thing Ethan saw before his vision blacked out was the shadow's face emerging from the darkness, a grotesque grin carved into a void. And then there was nothing. When Ethan woke, sunlight poured through the window, a blinding contrast to the suffocating darkness that had consumed him hours before. His body ached, every muscle stiff as if he'd been crushed beneath a weight. He pulled himself upright, his breath shallow, the memory of the shadow clinging to him like cobwebs. "Enough," he rasped. His voice sounded alien, raw from screaming. "I'm done." With shaking hands, Ethan stuffed what little he could into a duffel bag, a few clothes, his wallet, and the keys to his car. He didn't care about the rest. He just needed to leave. The apartment seemed almost calm now, as if the building itself were mocking him. The walls were quiet. The air, though still stale, felt breathable again. But Ethan knew better. It was a trick, a lure. He grabbed the doorknob and hesitated, his heart pounding. For the first time in days, it turned easily. The door opened without a sound. The hallway outside was empty. No shadows, no whispers, just light filtering in from the far end. Ethan stepped out, his footsteps unnaturally loud against the silence. He didn't look back as he descended the stairs, his duffel bouncing against his side. The front door of the building groaned as he pushed it open, the sunlight outside flooding over him like salvation. Ethan staggered onto the cracked sidewalk, gasping the fresh air as though he'd been drowning. He didn't stop walking until he reached his car. The engine sputtered to life, and Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, staring at the building through the rearview mirror. It stood there, silent and unassuming, as though nothing had ever happened. For a moment, Ethan almost convinced himself it had all been a nightmare, a breakdown born of stress and isolation. But then he saw it. Up on the third floor, in the window of 3C, the shadow stood. Its outline was unmistakable, dark, still. Watching him, Ethan's blood turned to ice. He tore his gaze away, slammed the car into drive, and sped off down the street. He didn't look back again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow's eyes were still on him, waiting. The Forbidden Name. Tom Parker always believed urban legends were just exaggerated tales, but something about them called to him, like whispers in the dark, daring him to dig deeper. It was an obsession that led him to places most people wouldn't dare step into. Today, that place was Millbrook Public Library, or what was left of it. The library had been abandoned for over 2 decades. A crumbling relic of a bygone era, its roof sagged under the weight of time, and its windows were veiled with grime, letting only thin streaks of pale light seep through. Tom stood outside, hesitating, staring up at the faded sign, Millbrook Public Library. The words were barely legible, paint flaking like dead skin. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the heavy oak door open, and it groaned in protest, a sound that seemed far too human. Inside, a stale, musty air greeted him, thick and suffocating. The scent of decay was everywhere, mixing with the faint, almost sweet odor of old paper. The library was a graveyard of knowledge. Rows of bookshelves stretched into the gloom, their spines broken and bindings split, like the skeletons of forgotten stories. Books lay scattered across the floor, some torn apart, pages yellowed and curling. Dust hung in the air, swirling like ghostly apparitions in the dim shafts of light. Tom switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long, central desk where the librarian might have once sat, surrounded by toppled chairs and shattered glass. He shivered involuntarily. The silence felt too complete, as though the building were holding its breath. "Just a library," he muttered to himself, though the words didn't settle his nerves. Tom had heard the rumors about this place. Locals claimed it was cursed, that something terrible had happened here, something no one wanted to talk about. Most people stayed far away, but for Tom, the rumors were an invitation. If there was any truth to the legends, it might be hiding here, waiting to be uncovered. He moved deeper into the library, his footsteps muffled by layers of dust and forgotten debris. Shadows danced along the walls, teasing the edges of his vision. At times, he could almost swear he heard faint whispers, too soft to understand, but persistent enough to make him look over his shoulder. Of course, there was nothing there. In the far corner of the library, tucked behind a collapsed shelf, Tom spotted an ancient wooden table. Its surface was scarred and chipped, but something about it caught his eye. On the table sat a single book. Unlike the others strewn about, this one seemed intact. Tom approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The book had no title, no markings on its cracked, leather-bound cover. It looked old, older than anything else in the room. Hesitating, he reached out and brushed his fingers over it. The leather was cold, unnaturally so. "What are you doing here?" Tom whispered aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. The whispers grew louder. Or perhaps it was just his imagination. He glanced around nervously before pulling up a chair. Dust erupted from the cushion as he sat, but Tom hardly noticed. He placed the flashlight on the table, angling it so the beam fell across the book. Slowly, almost reverently, he opened the cover. The first page was blank. So was the second. Tom flipped through several more. Empty, 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 until finally, words appeared, scrawled in jagged black ink. The handwriting was wild, uneven, as though written by someone in a frenzy. "Speak not its name, for to speak is to summon is to serve." Tom frowned, rereading the strange warning. He flipped another page. This time, there was something else, a name, written in the same frenzied hand. It was a word unlike any he had ever seen, its letters foreign and twisted, almost alive on the paper. "What does that even mean?" he muttered, leaning closer. His lips unconsciously formed the first syllable, but before he could utter it aloud, a sound echoed through the library. A sharp, sudden thump. Tom froze. His heart hammered in his chest as he whipped his head toward the direction of the noise. "Hello?" His voice cracked. It was supposed to sound brave, but in the stillness, it only seemed to provoke the darkness. There was no response, just silence. Then, another thump, louder this time, as though something heavy had fallen or moved. Tom's flashlight flickered. His pulse quickened as shadows thickened in the corners of the room, pressing closer. He forced a breath into his lungs and looked back at the book. The name on the page had changed. It was no longer just a word. It was pulsing, writhing like a living thing, the ink bleeding across the paper. Tom slammed the book shut, his chest heaving. No, not today. Grabbing the flashlight, he stumbled to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor with an ear-splitting screech. The sound echoed, reverberating through the library, and for a split second, Tom thought he heard it mirrored. Like something else was moving, scraping closer. He turned toward the exit, shining his flashlight across the room. For a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing just beyond the shelves, tall, motionless, shrouded in shadows. "Just my imagination," Tom whispered. "It's just." The figure shifted. Tom ran. He sprinted through the darkened aisles, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he searched for the exit. The whispers were everywhere now, rising to a chaotic crescendo, voices overlapping in a language he couldn't understand. Behind him, something moved, footsteps, slow but deliberate, like whatever it was knew he couldn't escape. Finally, the front door loomed ahead, just a few feet away. Tom barreled toward it, throwing his weight against the wood. It burst open, and he stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The sunlight hit him like a slap, and he blinked, disoriented. When he turned to look back, the library was silent again. Empty, but he still felt it, that name, seared into his mind, twisting just below the surface. And he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Tom hadn't returned to the Millbrook Library since that day, but the memory clung to him like cobwebs in the corners of his mind, impossible to brush away. He could still see that thing in the shadows. Or had he imagined it? He wasn't sure anymore. For days, he tried to go about his life as usual. His apartment in downtown Millbrook felt smaller than before, the walls pressing in just a little too close. At night, he would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, swearing he could hear faint whispers, a soft, rhythmic murmuring just beyond the edge of understanding. Then came the dreams. Each night, He would find himself back in the library. He stood alone, the same frigid air nipping at his skin as he walked among the dust and ruin. And every time, he would see it, a shape lingering at the end of an aisle. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, a shadow against shadows, featureless and unnatural, like a tear in the very fabric of the room. When he woke, it felt as though something had followed him back. The nightmares continued until Tom couldn't take it anymore. "I have to go back," he muttered to himself, pacing his tiny apartment. The logical part of his brain screamed that it was a terrible idea, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he saw, or imagined, was unfinished. He needed answers. That evening, Tom found himself once again standing in front of the Millbrook Library. It was darker now, the sun having set just minutes earlier, leaving the sky a bruised shade of purple. The building looked more menacing than before, as though it had been waiting for him. He hesitated at the door, fingers trembling as he pushed it open. The same creaking groan welcomed him, echoing in the emptiness beyond. The air inside was colder this time and heavier. It smelled worse too, like wet earth and something faintly metallic. Tom clicked on his flashlight and stepped forward, his footsteps sending tiny clouds of dust swirling up from the ground. "Just a quick look," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the gloom. The library seemed unchanged, desolate, broken, and forgotten. But there was something different about the silence. It felt aware, as though the very walls were listening. He moved cautiously through the aisles, his flashlight sweeping across rotting shelves and sagging piles of books. The beam passed over the table where he'd found the nameless book, but it was empty now. Tom frowned, his skin prickling. "Where is it?" he muttered, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. He turned, ready to leave, but then he saw it. At the far end of the aisle, where the light barely reached, stood a figure. Tom froze. The flashlight wavered in his shaking hands, the beam cutting through the darkness but failing to reveal any detail. The figure was tall and thin, its silhouette unnaturally straight and rigid, as though it had been carved from stone. But there was something horribly wrong. The figure had no face. Tom blinked, his breath caught in his throat. His mind tried to rationalize it. A shadow, a trick of the light, anything, but it wasn't. It stood too still, too solid, and he could feel it staring at him. Even without eyes, it was watching. "Who are you?" Tom managed to choke out. The figure didn't move. Tom's flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed, sputtered, and went dark. The aisle was plunged into darkness. "No, no, no," Tom hissed, smacking the flashlight in his palm. After a moment, the light came back, weak and pale, but enough to see that the figure was gone. Tom whipped his head around, sweeping the beam in every direction. The aisle was empty. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he took a shaky step forward. "Get a grip," he whispered to himself. "It's nothing. Just a sound. A single, hollow tap." Tom froze. The noise came from behind him, just a few feet away. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned. The figure was there. It stood at the end of the aisle, closer this time, its faceless head tilted as though studying him. The flashlight began to flicker again, the light blinking in and out like a dying heartbeat. Tom's chest tightened, and his legs refused to move. The figure took a step forward. Tap. Tom stumbled back, his flashlight shaking wildly. He turned and bolted down the aisle, his breath ragged as he weaved between the broken shelves. Behind him, the sound of footsteps echoed softly, calm, deliberate, and too close. "Leave me alone," Tom shouted, his voice cracking. He sprinted past the librarian's desk, leaping over fallen books as the whispers returned. They grew louder, swirling around him, a chaotic chorus of voices in a language he couldn't understand. The sound filled his head, buzzing like angry bees, drowning out his thoughts. Tom skidded to a stop near the entrance, gasping for breath. He glanced back. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, but the figure was gone. Or so he thought. When he turned back toward the exit, it was standing there, blocking the door. This time, it was close enough to touch. Tom's light fell across its form, and he saw it more clearly. Its skin, or whatever passed for skin, was smooth, pale, and featureless, like a porcelain doll with no eyes, no mouth, no nose. But the worst part was its posture. It leaned slightly forward, its head cocked, as though listening. Tom backed away slowly, his heart slamming in his chest. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to, because in the silence that followed, Tom understood something with chilling certainty. It didn't want anything. It simply was. The flashlight flickered again, and this time, it died completely. Tom was plunged into total darkness, and then he heard it, right next to his ear, a whisper. Soft, lingering. It said the name from the book. Tom screamed. Tom's heart still pounded in his chest as the last remnants of the figure faded into the darkness. He had barely escaped the library, stumbling out of the doors and into the crisp night air, gasping for breath as if the very shadows had pressed against him. His mind was racing. The faceless figure, the whispers. It was all too much to comprehend, too much to ignore. He was not the type of person to believe in ghosts or curses, but the events of that night were forcing him to confront something he couldn't explain. Just breathe, he muttered to himself, running his hands through his hair, trying to regain control. Tom paced the small, dimly lit sidewalk outside the library, his flashlight still clenched tightly in his hand, though the beam flickered weakly. He kept turning back, eyes darting to the entrance, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting. But the library was silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But Tom knew better. The thing was real, and it had followed him. When he finally made it home, it was almost dawn. His apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside his window, set his nerves on edge. Tom knew he had to go back. He couldn't keep running from whatever it was that haunted him. The figure, the name, it was all connected. He sat down at his desk, trembling, and pulled out the tattered notebook where he had written down everything he could remember about his encounter with the library. There was one thing that still gnawed at him. The name he had almost spoken. He had come so close to uttering it, but somehow, something inside him had stopped him. Something primal, something that warned him not to. Taking a deep breath, Tom reached for the forbidden book. He hadn't been able to bring himself to open it after his last visit, but now, the desire to understand, to know, was overwhelming. He opened the cover, and as his fingers brushed over the first page, the chilling sensation of being watched returned. It felt as though the book itself were aware of him, sensing his intentions. The pages were the same as before, blank and empty, but then he found it. The name. It wasn't just a word anymore. It had transformed into something else, something alive. It pulsed beneath the ink, as though the letters were trying to escape, to move. The more Tom stared at it, the more it seemed to call out to him, drawing him in like a dark siren's song. He leaned in closer. The name whispered to him. It wasn't just in his mind. It was real, as if the letters themselves were vibrating in his ear. He could feel the words pressing against his consciousness, urging him to read them aloud. But he resisted. He knew what would happen if he spoke it. He had already seen the consequences of disturbing this dark power. Tom's fingers hovered above the book, torn between curiosity and terror. His throat was dry, but the name wouldn't leave his mind. Finally, against every instinct screaming inside him, he read it. The name escaped his lips in a ragged breath, but as soon as he spoke it, everything around him seemed to freeze. The air turned cold, and a terrible pressure filled the room, pushing down on him from all sides. The floor beneath him groaned, and he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. Tom jumped back, knocking his chair over in the process. The flashlight in his hand flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to move, bending and twisting as if they had a life of their own. The whispers were back, louder this time, more frantic. But it wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling. Tom's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as he felt an unseen presence in the room with him. It was as though something was standing right behind him, breathing down his neck. But when he whirled around, there was nothing there. He turned back to the book. The name was still on the page, but it had changed, twisted, jagged now, like a carving made in haste. The ink bled across the paper, as though the words themselves were alive, seeking to escape the confines of the book. In that moment, Tom realized that he had made a terrible mistake. A cold, creeping dread filled him as he slammed the book shut. His hands were trembling, and his mind was in chaos. The shadows in the room seemed darker, deeper, pressing in on him from every direction. Then, as his fingers gripped the spine of the book, he noticed something. A small slip of paper tucked between the pages, almost as though it had been hidden there on purpose. Tom pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a note, written hastily in the same jagged handwriting as the name. "Do not speak the name." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that threatened to crush him. Tom's stomach churned as he read the note over and over, realizing the full extent of his mistake. He had already said the name, and now there would be no going back. He dropped the paper, feeling his chest tighten as the air around him thickened, heavy with the unmistakable presence of something unnatural. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on him, and the shadows, once fleeting and indistinct, now had shape, sharp, angular, alive. The whispers rose again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices, all speaking in that same foreign language, and among them, just beneath the noise, he thought he could hear it. A low, guttural growl. Something was coming. Tom backed away, his legs unsteady, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But there was nowhere to go. The door was behind him, but the figure, the shadow, the thing that had no face, was blocking the way. It was standing there, right in front of him, its dark presence a wall he couldn't escape. The darkness closed in. The whispers grew into screams, and Tom Parker knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that there was no escape. Tom's mind was a whirlpool of panic, spinning faster and faster as the darkness in the room seemed to constrict around him. The note, that simple warning, hung in his mind like a bell tolling in a distant cathedral. Do not speak the name. But it was too late. The name was already spoken, already called into existence, and now the air itself seemed to pulse with a terrible, living energy. He could feel it, them, pressing in, encircling him. The shadows were no longer passive. They seemed to move, slowly and deliberately, like something stalking him in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards felt like the slow, deliberate steps of an unseen presence drawing closer. Every whisper, now sharper and more distinct, crawled under his skin like insects, crawling in his veins. The flashlight trembled in his hand as Tom took a step back. His heart pounded in his ears. He tried to push through the terror, to think logically, to regain some control over the situation. But everything felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy. Every breath felt like he was inhaling something toxic. The walls of his apartment, once comforting and familiar, now felt alien, as though they were closing in on him. He grabbed the book again, his fingers numbed by fear, but still desperately clutching it, as though it could offer some kind of salvation. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as the whispers grew louder, a low murmur that was growing more insistent. The voices didn't just come from the book. They were everywhere, crawling from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around him. He couldn't ignore them any longer. The whispers were forming words now, words he could almost understand, but not quite. They were jagged, broken, like a language corrupted by time itself. He opened the book again, his stomach churning as the name seemed to writhe on the page, its letters twisting and changing. But the moment his eyes lingered on the name, a violent chill rushed through him. It was as though the temperature of the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. His breath came out in visible clouds, each exhale sharp and cold. And then, the whispers spoke his name. It was faint at first, a breathy echo that could have been imagined. But as Tom leaned closer, trying to make sense of the words, it became clearer. Tom. His pulse quickened, blood rushing to his ears. The voice didn't sound like a human voice. It was something else, something ancient and wrong, vibrating through the very air, rattling his bones. He snapped the book shut. The room fell silent. The whispers cut off as abruptly as they had begun. But the silence was far worse. It was dead, oppressive, like the calm before the storm. Then came the thump. It was soft at first, distant, like a footstep echoing through the darkness. Tom's body stiffened. The sound came again, closer this time, and again. Each step was slow, deliberate, methodical. He turned toward the sound, but the room was still empty. His flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams across the walls. The light seemed to strain against the darkness, flickering, sputtering, as if it were alive and trying to escape the suffocating weight of the shadows. And then, he saw it. The figure was back. It stood in the doorway of his bedroom, its tall, thin form towering over the threshold. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the flashlight beam illuminated it. The faceless shape was standing just outside, its presence an oppressive force that seemed to steal the very air from his lungs. Tom's pulse roared in his ears, his legs frozen, unable to move. The figure's silhouette didn't shift. It didn't lean forward or make any movement, but somehow, Tom knew it was watching him. The shadows around it seemed to warp and twist, bending unnaturally as though they were extending, reaching for him. He couldn't look away. The figure was compelling, not in any way that was pleasant, but in a horrifying, irresistible way. His body screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. The air seemed to grow even heavier, suffocating him with a palpable weight, a feeling like something was pushing in from all directions, crushing him under its sheer presence. The whispers returned, louder this time, as though they were coming from all around him. They were no longer mere echoes, but a cacophony of voices, speaking, chanting in a language that he couldn't place, but that felt old, older than any tongue he had ever heard. Each word seemed to crawl into his ears, down his spine, and settle in his chest, making it harder to breathe. Tom's vision blurred, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he looked down at the book in his lap. The name, was still there, burning in his mind, writhed on the page like a serpent. The figure took a step forward. Thump. The sound reverberated in the stillness of the room, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to echo through Tom's very bones. The tension was unbearable. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to do something, to run, to fight back. But he couldn't. The force in the room, the sheer presence of the figure, was too much. It was like an invisible weight, pressing him down, pushing him into the ground. The whispers now surrounded him. Tom? Tom. It was as though the figure was speaking directly to him, its voice an overwhelming, guttural rasp that crawled inside his skull. He tried to move. He tried to stand, to break free from the nightmare. But his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, his muscles locked in place as though some unseen force had anchored him to the floor. The figure took another step. Thump. It was right next to him now, so close that Tom could feel the cold radiating off it, ice cold, like it was made of the very essence of the void itself. The whispers intensified, growing into a frenzy, a crescendo of incomprehensible sounds that filled his head, pushing him to the edge of madness. And then, in the middle of the chaos, something inside Tom snapped. The book. He grabbed it, his fingers shaking, and opened it once more. This time, when he looked at the name, he didn't just feel fear. He felt compulsion. The name wanted to be spoken. It demanded it. He could feel it pulsing, like a heartbeat, an urge to say it, to utter it. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he realized too late that it wasn't him in control anymore. It was the name. Tom ran. His heart hammered violently against his chest as his feet pounded the cold, cracked pavement outside the library. The night air sliced through him, but he barely felt it. His mind was consumed by one single, horrifying thought. It's too late. He had heard the whispers clearly now, no longer just faint murmurs in the back of his mind, but voices, distinct and growing louder, swirling around him, speaking that name. The name he had uttered, the name that had broken the delicate boundary between the world he knew and the darkness that now surrounded him. The figure, that faceless shadow, was gone. Its presence had vanished the moment he'd spoken the name, but Tom could still feel it. It was with him, The very air around him seemed heavier, pressing down with a suffocating weight, as if the universe itself was closing in. The whispers were still there, echoing in his mind, reverberating through the dark corners of his consciousness. It was them, the voices, the shadows. They had followed him, and he could no longer escape. He reached his apartment in a daze, stumbling up the stairs, breathless, as the whispers curled around him like smoke. The door to his apartment slammed shut behind him, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he could feel it, the cold. That icy, unnatural chill that had clung to him in the library now filled his home. It was as though the shadows had followed him, seeping through the walls, the floor, the very air. Tom leaned against the door, his fingers trembling as they brushed across the lock. But he knew, deep down, that no matter how much he bolted the door, no matter how many lights he turned on, he couldn't escape it. The presence was inside now. It had already found its way in. The whispers began again. Tom, Tom. His mind raced. His eyes darted to the book still lying on his desk, the same book that had started all of this. He had tried to get rid of it. He had thrown it into the fire, but the next morning, it had been there again, on his desk, its pages empty, except for that name. That cursed name. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. He hadn't been able to ignore the pull, the force that had drawn him to it. And now, he realized with a sinking feeling that he would never be able to forget it. The whispers began to change, twisting into something more urgent. They were no longer soft, gentle murmurs in the distance. They were right there, in his ear, in his head. The voices overlapped, frenzied, clawing at his mind. He clutched his head in his hands, pressing his palms against his temples, desperate to block it out. But the sound only grew louder, more insistent. He could feel the words crawling through his thoughts, pushing him to speak them, to say it again. Tom shook his head violently, his breath ragged, his pulse racing. No, I won't. Tom. The name was like a poison in his veins now, a constant, gnawing presence, and there was no escaping it. He could feel the walls closing in, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The air was suffocating, thick with an oppressive force. And that sound, that whisper, it was everywhere, echoing around him. Do not speak the name. The words of the warning, the note he had found in the book, rang in his mind. But it was too late. He had already spoken it. He had already summoned something far worse than he could ever comprehend. The light flickered. The shadows in his apartment grew longer, stretching toward him with every passing second. They twisted and writhed as though alive, reaching, clawing for him. Tom stumbled backward, his vision spinning, the room tilting at unnatural angles. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry. His legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed onto the floor, clutching his head as the whispers became a deafening roar in his ears. The walls seemed to bend in on themselves, closing in around him, suffocating him in a sea of blackness. And then, through the chaos, through the relentless storm of voices, he heard it. A low, guttural sound, something that was both outside and inside at the same time. A voice? No, not a voice. Something far worse. Something ancient. And it spoke the name. Tom's heart stopped. His eyes widened in horror as the words echoed in his mind. The name rising up, tearing through him like a blade. The shadows converged. They were all around him now, no longer distant and intangible, but here, now, wrapping around him, suffocating him. The weight of the darkness was unbearable, and Tom couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. The last thing he saw was the faceless figure, standing in the corner of the room, its silhouette indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. The name, the forbidden name, had become a part of him, a part of the very air, a part of the silence. And no matter how far he ran, it would follow him, for the name could never be unspoken. It was too late. The Whispering Well. Jack Miller had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. After years of dealing with the relentless pressure of corporate life, he finally made the decision to leave everything behind. The opportunity to buy the old farmhouse in the rural heart of Texas seemed like the perfect escape. The farmhouse had been abandoned for decades, tucked away in the far corner of the county, far from any major town or city. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace and solitude. What more could he ask for? The drive there had taken hours, the last stretch of road winding through barren fields and neglected roads. The landscape was a dry, desolate sea of yellowish brown. It was the kind of place where the air seemed to hang heavy, suffocating the land. Not a tree in sight, just the occasional scattered shrub, twisted and brittle from the intense Texan sun. Jack's truck came to a halt at the old farmhouse. The paint on the house was peeling, the roof sagging, and the windows were cracked, letting in the harsh light that poured through. The air smelled stale, like dust and decay, but to Jack, it was the scent of freedom. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The silence around him was unnerving. Not a bird chirped, not a breeze stirred the parched grass. The only sound was the faint, distant hum of the wind through the empty fields. Jack grabbed his duffel bag from the back of his truck and made his way toward the house. As he approached, the overwhelming stillness of the place pressed in on him. It felt like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone, anyone, to return. He noticed the overgrown weeds around the base of the house, their wild tendrils creeping over the foundation. The front door creaked when he pushed it open, revealing a dark, dust-choked hallway. There was something eerie about the house, but Jack was determined to make it his new home. After settling in and unloading his things, Jack decided to explore the land. He wandered past the dilapidated barn, through a dense thicket of tangled brush, and eventually found himself near the far corner of the property. That's when he saw it. The ground beneath his feet seemed to dip, as though something had been buried there long ago. His curiosity piqued. Jack knelt down and brushed aside the layers of dirt and weeds. Beneath his hands, he felt the cold, smooth surface of stone. A chill ran down his spine. The stone didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the natural landscape. He grabbed a nearby shovel and began to dig, each shovel full of dirt feeling heavier than the last, as if something was pulling him deeper into the earth. As the hole grew larger, the outline of an old stone well emerged, its edges worn smooth by the passage of time. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The well was deep, far deeper than he had expected. At the very bottom, he could just make out the faintest glimmer of something metallic, but it was too far down to identify. The air around the well was unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat of the afternoon sun. He shivered involuntarily, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, and then, without thinking twice, he grabbed the old rope that dangled from a rusted pulley above the well. The rope creaked as it unraveled, and Jack slowly lowered a wooden bucket into the darkness. The sound of the rope scraping against the well's sides sent a wave of unease through him, but he continued, lowering the bucket further, until it disappeared into the blackness below. As the bucket descended, Jack noticed something strange. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around him in a sudden gust that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A soft, whispering sound reached his ears, faint, almost imperceptible at first. His eyes darted around, but there was no one there, just the wind and the whispering. It felt as if the air itself was speaking, as if the earth was trying to tell him something, something he wasn't meant to hear. He shook his head and pulled the bucket back up, his heart pounding in his chest. The bucket came to rest at the edge of the well, and as Jack reached to retrieve it, he noticed something strange. A small, weathered object had attached itself to the rope. He pulled it free, and as he held it in his hand, his stomach lurched. It was an old, tarnished locket. He opened it cautiously, revealing a faded photograph of a woman he didn't recognize. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder still, and Jack felt a sharp sensation, like an invisible hand had reached out and grasped his chest. He staggered backward, nearly losing his balance as a wave of dizziness overtook him. The whispers in the air seemed to swirl around him, their words unintelligible, but filled with an unmistakable urgency. It was as if something beneath the earth was calling to him, pulling him in, urging him to listen. With his heart racing, Jack dropped the locket and stumbled away from the well. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the spot. The whispers didn't stop. They followed him, lingering in the air, almost as if they were inside his head. The wind died down and the whispering faded, but Jack knew something had changed. There was something about that well, something dark and ancient. It wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far worse than he could imagine. And as he looked back at the well, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something that had been buried for a reason. With his mind racing and his pulse still thundering in his ears, Jack made his way back to the farmhouse. The silence that had greeted him when he first arrived now felt oppressive, as if the house itself was watching him, waiting. The night was thick with silence, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath, stretching out the hours in a heavy, suffocating blanket. Jack lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and unease. His hands still tingled from where the locket had brushed against his fingers, and the whispering voice was like a constant hum in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him in the dark, something that had been stirred by his discovery. The house felt colder now, even with the heat of the Texas summer still lingering outside. Jack pulled the worn covers tighter around him, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at him. His thoughts kept drifting back to the well, its deep, foreboding darkness and the strange sensation of being watched. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the quiet of the countryside making him feel this way. It was something more. The wind had begun to pick up again, but this time, it wasn't the gentle rustling of leaves or the occasional creak of the house settling. No, this was different. The air outside felt charged, heavy with an energy that was almost palpable. Jack tried to ignore it, but the unsettling feeling only grew as the minutes passed. And then, in the stillness of the night, it happened. A low, grating sound, like a distant groan or the creak of ancient wood, echoed from the direction of the well. At first, Jack thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, closer this time. His breath caught in his throat as a voice, deep and raspy, cut through the silence of the night. Jack. The sound of his name, whispered in that eerie, unnatural tone, sent a chill racing down his spine. It wasn't just the sound of the wind. No, this was different, too deliberate, too clear. The voice was coming from the well. Jack sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice had been unmistakable, and it carried with it a sense of urgency, as if it had been waiting for him. He hesitated for a moment, unable to shake the sense of dread that filled the room. His mind raced. There was no one else on the property. He had made sure of that. But still, the voice lingered in his mind, calling to him like a ghost from the past. Jack. It came again, and this time, the voice seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Jack swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cool wooden floor beneath his feet sending a shiver up his spine. His head spun with questions, with fear, but he couldn't ignore the pull of the voice. He had to know. He had to understand. The farmhouse was dark, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and the lingering warmth of the day. The old wooden floor creaked under Jack's weight as he made his way toward the door, his heart thudding in his chest with every step. He opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped outside. The wind had died down, but there was something in the air now, something that didn't feel right. He made his way to the well, his breath shallow, his body tense. The night was heavy with the same oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of his own footsteps. The well stood in the corner of the property, its stone surface bathed in the pale light of the moon. Jack could feel it calling to him, beckoning him closer. The wind had completely stilled, and for a moment, everything felt too still, too quiet. And then, as he neared the edge of the well, he heard it again. Jack. It was louder now, clearer. The voice seemed to rise from the depths of the earth, filling the air around him, vibrating through his bones. He felt a coldness wash over him, like icy fingers tracing along his spine, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he was certain that something was watching him from the darkness below. "Do you fear?" the voice rasped, its tone low and menacing. It seemed to slither out of the well like a snake, its words curling around his mind, twisting it. "Do you fear the dark, Jack?" His throat went dry, and his pulse quickened. Jack could barely breathe, the air thickening around him as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. His mind screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the well as possible, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught in the grip of the voice, unable to tear himself away. "Fear is a powerful thing," the voice continued, each word dragging itself out with slow deliberation. "It feeds on your weaknesses, Jack. It lives in the dark, waiting for the right moment to consume you." Jack's thoughts raced. He had never believed in things like this, ghosts, spirits, or any kind of supernatural nonsense. He had always been a man of logic, of reason, but as the voice whispered through the night, he felt something shift inside him. The words seemed to burrow deep into his mind, planting seeds of doubt and terror. What if there was something to this? What if there was more to the well than he had first realized? "Why do you fear the dark, Jack?" The voice was almost a growl now, its presence suffocating. "Is it because you know, deep down, that there is no escape from it?" Jack's breath hitched as the weight of the words settled over him like a physical force. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. His mind screamed for him to break free, but all he could do was stand there, staring into the blackness of the well, his every instinct telling him to flee, yet he was rooted to the spot. The voice faded then, leaving only the empty silence behind. Jack stood frozen, his heart thumping in his chest, unsure of what he had just experienced. The chill in the air lingered, thick and suffocating, and the darkness of the night seemed even more oppressive than before. He had heard the voice, had felt it crawl beneath his skin, and yet he still didn't know what it meant. But one thing was certain: whatever it was that lived in that well, whatever force had called to him, was not something he could ignore. Not anymore. Jack stumbled backward, his eyes still fixed on the well, as the whispering voice seemed to echo in his mind. "Do you fear, Jack?" it asked again, as if it was waiting for an answer. The night had taken on an unnatural weight, as though the very air had grown dense with secrets that refused to remain hidden. Jack stood at the edge of the well, staring down into the black abyss below. The voice, low and haunting, still echoed in his ears. "Do you fear, Jack?" it had asked, twisting his thoughts, creeping into the corners of his mind where dark memories lay buried. The well's call had rattled him, shaken him in ways he couldn't explain. He had to know more. He had to understand what was happening. The stillness around him was oppressive. The air felt thick with something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. Jack swallowed hard, pushing the unease that had settled in his chest aside. His breath came in shallow bursts, and every instinct screamed for him to walk away, to leave the well and the strange voice behind. But the need to know, to make sense of it all, was stronger than the fear gnawing at his insides. Determined, Jack retrieved his flashlight from his jacket pocket, its beam cutting through the darkness like a thin thread of light. He turned it on, the bright white glow illuminating the stone walls of the well, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. He lowered the light toward the hole, peering into the depths below. The beam cut through the blackness, but as far as he could see, there was no end to the well. It seemed to stretch infinitely downward, as though it reached into the very bowels of the earth. A shiver ran down his spine as he knelt beside the well, trying to steady his breathing. He shone the flashlight along the stone walls, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The surface of the stone was smooth, almost polished, and the air around the well was unnervingly cold, colder than it should have been for a Texas night. There was no natural explanation for it, no breeze or current of air that could account for the chilling sensation that seemed to emanate from the well itself. With trembling hands, Jack untied the rope from his truck, securing one end to a nearby post. He tied a sturdy knot, ensuring that it was fastened tightly before lowering the other end into the well. The rope creaked as it unspooled, the sound echoing in the stillness. Jack held his breath as the rope descended, its length quickly disappearing into the void below. His pulse quickened, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. What was he looking for? What did he hope to find? He waited for a few moments, his mind racing, before he began pulling the rope back up. It was heavy, slow, almost like there was something pulling against him from the other side. But when the rope reached the surface again, it was empty. No object had been pulled up, nothing had snagged on the line. He peered into the well again, feeling the strange, suffocating weight of the silence. The flashlight's beam flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding stones. And then it came again. The voice. Jack. It was softer this time, but no less insistent. The sound of his name, spoken like a secret shared in the darkness, made his stomach churn. He looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the empty field, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't coming from the shadows, wasn't coming from any living thing. It was coming from the well, from the depths of the earth itself. Jack, you remember, don't you? The voice whispered, its tone shifting like something ancient, something far too familiar. You remember what you did? His heart skipped a beat. A cold sweat broke out across his brow as the words sunk in. It was as if the voice knew him, as if it had seen into the very core of his being. A flood of memories rushed through his mind. Memories he had buried long ago, deep beneath the layers of his own shame and guilt. There was the image of his sister, Laura, smiling up at him from the front porch of their childhood home. Her laughter had been the soundtrack to his youth, a constant source of comfort and warmth. But there were other memories, darker memories, ones that he had pushed away. The night they had fought, the night he had yelled at her, told her things that no sibling should ever say to another. The way she had stormed out of the house, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. The sound of the car engine as it roared down the road, the way the tires screeched as she left. Jack had never seen her again. The next day, the call came. She had been in a car accident, the car flipping over on a sharp curve. But the memory that haunted him the most, the memory that he could never outrun, was the last thing he had said to her. Jack, you remember, don't you? The voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, its tone now laced with something darker, something that chilled him to the bone. You never apologized. You never told her you loved her before she left. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the well, his knuckles white with strain. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as the weight of the voice's words pressed down on him. He had always blamed himself for Laura's death, for the fight they had, for the things he had said. He had spent years running from that guilt, hiding behind the walls he had built around himself. But now, here it was again, the voice pulling that buried memory to the surface. Do you still fear, Jack? The voice was louder now, more insistent, its presence swelling around him like a suffocating fog. You cannot escape your past. It follows you, Jack. It always will. Jack recoiled, his stomach turning as the weight of his guilt pressed in on him. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. He wanted to scream, wanted to run far away from the well, from the voice, from everything that was clawing its way back to the surface. But he couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the truth that was being forced into his mind. The voice faded, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive in the air around him. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence he had encountered earlier. It was thick with something ancient, something that refused to let go. Jack took a step back, his eyes still locked on the well. Whatever lay beneath that dark, endless hole, whatever force was speaking to him from the depths, was not something he could ignore. The well was calling to him, and it was pulling him closer, dredging up memories and fears he wasn't ready to face. The worst part was that he knew, deep down, that he couldn't stop now. The truth had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The night had grown colder, the air thick with an unnatural chill that seeped into Jack's bones. His hands were shaking as he stood at the edge of the well, his heart still racing from the haunting voice that had dredged up his darkest memories. He had barely recovered from the shock when it came again. A whisper, soft yet insistent, seeping into his mind like a shadow. Jack. The voice was familiar now, like an old friend or an enemy that had always been there, lurking in the background. His pulse quickened, and his breath came in short, jagged bursts. The weight of the voice was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides, as though the very air around him had thickened with the force of the presence that emanated from the well. But this time, something was different. There was an edge to the voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the whispers of guilt and fear anymore. There was something more, something malevolent, something that was now fully aware of Jack's presence. As Jack stood frozen, staring down into the blackness of the well, a sudden feeling of unease washed over him. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened so far. The whispers, the voice calling his name, the dark memories it had unearthed. Was it all real? Was the well truly calling him? Or had he simply lost his grip on reality? A soft rustling sound broke through his thoughts. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the beam cast an eerie light across the well's stone walls. The shadows seemed to dance, moving of their own accord. The faintest movement at the edge of the beam caught his attention. His eyes widened as he noticed it. A dark, indistinct shape moving at the periphery of his vision. Something was there. Before he could react, a cold, clammy sensation brushed against his wrist, followed by the unmistakable feeling of something, or someone, touching the flashlight. The beam wavered, jerking violently as if the light itself was being yanked downward. Jack gasped, his heart thundering in his chest, and pulled back instinctively. But the flashlight wouldn't budge. It was as though something had latched onto it, holding it firmly in place. Jack's breathing grew frantic as panic surged within him. He yanked at the flashlight with all his might, but it didn't come free. Then, with a sickening scrape, the beam flickered out. Darkness swallowed him whole. He stood there, heart racing, trembling from head to toe, unable to see anything, unable to move. But then, the flashlight flared back to life. The light returned with a harsh burst, and Jack's stomach dropped. The beam caught the surface of the well's stone walls, and for a fleeting second, the light illuminated something in the shadows. It was a hand, long, pale fingers, impossibly thin, gripping the flashlight. Jack recoiled, his breath caught in his throat. The hand was still there, just beyond the reach of the light, but it wasn't human. The fingers were too long, the skin too pale, and there was something wrong about the way they wrapped around the handle, as if the hand didn't belong to any living creature at all. It felt as if the darkness itself had come alive, reaching out from the depths of the well. The light flickered again, and for a split second, Jack saw something even more horrifying, a face. A twisted, contorted face, pale as death, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to stare directly at him. The face was distorted, as if it had been pulled from the shadows themselves, its features warped in ways that defied logic. The voice returned, louder now, almost a growl, rumbling from deep within the well. "Jack, you can't escape me." A surge of terror shot through him, and he stumbled back, his hands desperately clawing at the air as if trying to push the darkness away. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashlight fell from his grip, its light casting strange, trembling shadows around him. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, but the darkness seemed to be closing in around him, suffocating him, drawing him toward the well. Jack scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his hands slick with sweat. His body was frozen in terror, and he could barely think, could barely focus. The voice was relentless now, growing stronger with every passing second, as if it were a physical presence, a force pressing down on him. "You can't escape your past, Jack," the voice hissed. "You cannot outrun the truth." A cold gust of wind howled around him, and he felt something shift, something sharp and cold wrapping around his throat, squeezing tight, choking him. It wasn't the wind, though. It was something else, something from the well, something that had been waiting for him all along. The cold fingers dug into his skin, and Jack gasped, clawing at his throat as his vision blurred. He could hear the whispering, growing louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled his ears with the weight of all his regrets. The truth, the guilt, The darkness. Jack, you're not alone. The words echoed in his mind, like an icy dagger piercing through his thoughts. The well was alive, a thing of hunger and darkness, and it was pulling him in. He could feel it now, the suffocating grip tightening around him, dragging him closer to the edge. With a final, desperate cry, Jack pulled away, his body shaking as he scrambled backward, his hands grasping at anything to steady himself. The world around him seemed to spin, the voices growing louder, the darkness closing in. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything went silent. The air grew still. The pressure that had been bearing down on him lifted, as if something had suddenly released its grip. Jack gasped for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness. The well was silent now. The hand, the face, the voices, all gone. Jack stood alone in the night, his mind reeling, his body aching with the aftermath of the terror he had just experienced. The well loomed before him, its surface smooth and still, as if nothing had happened at all. But Jack knew better. He knew that whatever had reached out to him from the depths of the well wasn't finished. It wasn't done with him. The morning came too slowly, a pale light creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned land. Jack stood in front of the well, staring down at it with a mix of exhaustion and dread. His heart was still racing from the night before. The memories of the twisted hand, the horrifying face, the cold fingers that had gripped him so tightly, still fresh in his mind. The whispering voice lingered in his ears like a haunting melody, refusing to let him forget. He had tried to move on. He had tried to tell himself that it was all a figment of his imagination, an overactive mind spurred on by isolation and fear. But deep down, he knew the truth. The well was not just a relic of the past. It was alive, a force that had been waiting for him, watching him, pulling at him from the darkness beneath. Jack bent down, his body stiff with reluctance, and began to gather the rope he had left coiled by the edge of the well. The sun was high now, and the world seemed so much brighter than it had the night before. Yet there was no peace in his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that the well was calling to him again, that it was somehow waiting for him to return. With a deep breath, Jack took a shovel from the shed. He had made up his mind. He had to seal it for good. He couldn't live with the constant fear, the whispers that gnawed at his sanity. He had to put it all behind him. The memories, the voice, the well. It all had to be buried, and buried deep. He worked in silence, his hands moving mechanically as he shoveled dirt over the edge, filling in the hole. The earth was dry, heavy, and the process seemed endless. Each shovelful of dirt felt like another weight on his shoulders, another layer of the truth being buried beneath the soil. He had thought that closing the well, sealing it from view, would bring him relief, but with every stroke of the shovel, he felt the darkness pressing back in. The whispers returned. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling in the back of his mind, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across the ground. Then it grew louder, clearer, until the voice echoed in his ears once more. Jack. He froze mid-shovel, the weight of the word crashing into him like a tidal wave. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, and his hands went numb. The voice was unmistakable now, low, guttural, and somehow more real than it had ever been before. Jack, you cannot escape me. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting to the well. The dirt was almost level now, but it was as if the earth itself were rejecting his efforts, refusing to bury the past. He had to finish. He had to bury it all. But the voice wouldn't let him. It echoed through his skull, growing louder, more insistent. Jack, you can't escape yourself. You can't escape the truth. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the shovel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He stood there, paralyzed, listening to the voice that seemed to reverberate in every fiber of his being. The darkness was alive, feeding off his fear, and it wasn't letting him go. Not now, not ever. The ground felt cold beneath his feet, the air thick with the weight of things left unsaid, things left undone. He had tried to bury the past, but the past was not so easily forgotten. It was still there, waiting, lurking beneath the surface, ready to claw its way back to the light. With a final, desperate cry, Jack threw the shovel aside and dropped to his knees by the edge of the well, his hands clawing at the dirt, his nails scraping against the hard ground. He dug with frantic urgency, his fingers trembling, his breath shallow. The earth seemed to fight him every step of the way, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go. Jack. The voice was louder now, clearer, as if it were right behind him. He could almost feel the presence, a cold, malevolent force that wrapped around him like a vice, suffocating him. The truth was rising, and there was no way to stop it. And then, suddenly, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening. Jack froze, his hands covered in dirt, his body trembling. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, suffocating him. The well was still there, its depths still hidden beneath the earth. But the voice had gone. For a moment, just one fleeting moment, Jack thought he had won. He thought he had finally buried it all. The darkness, the guilt, the fear. He thought he could walk away, start anew. But as he stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands, he felt it, deep in his chest, a creeping, insidious sensation. It was as if the voice, the well, had never really gone away. It was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. Jack made his way back to the farmhouse, his heart heavy with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. The world around him seemed unchanged, but he knew better. The well was not gone. The darkness had not been buried. It was only waiting for him to return. That night, Jack lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to escape the images that plagued his mind. The whispers came again, soft and insistent, filling the corners of his dreams with shadows and cold hands. He could feel the voice now, inside his mind, its words like a pulse that throbbed beneath his skin. Jack. He awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he struggled to calm himself. The room was silent, still, but the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something that couldn't be ignored. The voice was there, in the very fabric of the room, in the beating of his heart. As Jack sat up in the bed, a cold chill swept through the room. He could hear it now, faint but unmistakable, the whispering, curling around the edges of his thoughts, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Jack. It was as if the well, the voice, had never truly left him. And as he lay back down, the darkness closed in once more. The whispers, the guilt, the voice. It would always be with him. Forever.